It was almost 2 years ago that the United States completely withdrew from Afghanistan, ending the 20-year-long war. Some see this pullout as an event that sparked utter chaos in the world. A new book titled Kabul, The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End, which contains eyewitness accounts from service members who participated in rescue efforts and stories from Americans and Afghan allies, makes the case that Joe Biden's Afghanistan retreat has spurred an incredibly dangerous new era.
Authors of Kabul, Jerry Dunleavy and James Hasson, join us now to discuss their reporting on what they found truly happened in Afghanistan's capital city. Thank you so much for joining us to break this down. I really want to start with just, the president, he says he's Irish. He often reminds us of this. This could be why his exit strategy was essentially an Irish goodbye in Afghanistan. But I think we all saw the aftermath immediately of the decision to pull out so quickly. Jerry, can you just say quickly what we weren't told, what wasn't reported on in those moments when we were watching folks flood planes on tarmacs and things of that nature?
Yeah, well, look, a big underreported thing for all of us. And by the way, James and I are both Irish, so the Irish excuse doesn't fly with us. One big thing that we uncovered in our book is how the Abbey Gate attack by this ISIS-K terrorist likely did not have to happen. A big part of that is President Biden's decision to abandon Bagram Air Base, a strategic air base very close to Kabul. This base would have been a much safer, smarter place to run an evacuation from. It would have given us the ability potentially to continue to keep the Taliban at bay. Certainly the Taliban never would have been able to take Bagram, but we also may have been able to keep them from taking Kabul. On top of that, this terrorist who conducted the attack on Abbey Gate that killed 13 Americans, he was in prison at Bagram Air Base. And he was in prison when we left the base and was freed by the Taliban on August 15th, 2021. So if we had simply maintained Bagram, it would have been smart, not just for our safe evacuation, but the terrorist who conducted the terrorist attack that killed 13 Americans, if we had held on to Bagram, he would have just been sitting behind bars.
If I can add to that very briefly,
Please.
I think one additional thing that we didn't know when we first started writing the book, we thought we had an idea, but we didn't even know a third of it, was just what the individual service members on the ground had to deal with and how heroically they acted. A term that comes up a whole lot when we speak with them is moral injury. And that is because due to the administration's just abject failure to plan, they were faced with impossible situations where if they had to turn somebody away because they didn't meet the criteria, desperate Afghans would grab the barrels of their weapons and try and pull them up to their heads and say, just shoot me now because then the Taliban is going to kill me anyway. They had to endure babies, witnessing babies get trampled at the gates, women throwing themselves on the razor wire to try and, basically prompt a rescue so they wouldn't have to go back through the Taliban checkpoints and be brutalized all over again. It was a horror show of the worst variety. And the administration's repeated descriptions of the Taliban as, quote, business-like and professional just couldn't have been further from the truth. And it's an insult to the men and women who served.
First of all, thank you both so much for writing this book, because we haven't been told the real story of what happened. And as we saw from the testimony of Gold Star families last week, there's a lot of resentment and rightful anger at the Biden administration for their role in the deaths of those 13 Americans. In the book, you write that the service members who were on the ground at Bagram were blindsided by the decision to close that base. From your understanding and your reporting, who told Biden that he should leave Bagram, and what was the intel that supported that decision, if there was any?
Nobody told Joe Biden that he should abandon Bagram. In fact, everybody told him that he shouldn't. Repeatedly, military leaders were urging him to keep Bagram open And to underscore the stupidity of that decision, the Obama administration, when Joe Biden was vice president, actually conducted a feasibility analysis of what an evacuation would look like and whether it could be run out of Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul, if they closed Bagram. And they concluded that it was a non-starter to try and do any evacuation without Bagram. But Joe Biden wanted to get out as fast as possible, and he wanted to be able to say they were, under 1,000 service members left in the country, and you can't hold Bagram with fewer than a few thousand service members. So it had to go. And we all witnessed the consequences of President Biden's decision.
And all I would add to that is I currently work on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, helping investigate this debacle. And I'm just speaking like in my personal capacity as an author, but we had the Command Sergeant Major, Jake Smith, who was tasked with shutting down Bagram. We had him testify, and he said that the State Department came to visit Bagram in early 2021. They came to visit from the embassy, and this Command Sergeant Major told them in no uncertain terms that doing an evacuation through Kabul would be an idiotic idea and that it had to be done through Bagram. And he says that these State Department folks agreed with him, because everybody knew that doing an evacuation through Kabul would be very dangerous. And of course, it became exponentially dangerous once the Taliban was controlling the entire country, and once we, the United States, had to rely on the Taliban, our enemy of 20 years, to provide security outside the airport. And the reason that we were put in that position was because of President Biden ignoring the facts on the ground and ignoring what everyone around him was telling him.
I want to actually turn us to the short-term policymaking we often find in the United States leading to disasters similar to this. There's a decision to fund and arm the Mujahideen during essentially the Cold War era. And this was a project that bin Laden was on our side with. And we saw the Mujahideen develop into the modern known Taliban. How has this short-term interventionist thinking led the United States to create terrorist groups that ultimately have anti-American sentiments and become a threat to us? And we destabilize regions as well and only achieve very short-term foreign policy goals. How much can we credit that history and short-term thinking to a lot of the disaster in Kabul and Afghanistan today?
Well, let me jump on that. So I think that Osama bin Laden actually likes to overstate the role that he played in the efforts fighting the Soviets when they ran Afghanistan. But it's absolutely true that the U.S., funded these Mujahideen groups. And I think where a lot of the problem comes from is that after the Soviet Union left, the United States took its eye off the ball on Afghanistan, and the Taliban was able to take over. And what I would point out about the Taliban is the Taliban, gave safe harbor to al-Qaeda for many years before the September 11th attacks. I mean, al-Qaeda was hitting the United States in our embassies in Africa, bombed the USS Cole, and then carried out the 9/11 attacks. And throughout it, the Taliban was harboring them. And even when we were getting ready to invade, the Taliban refused to hand Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda members over. And the Taliban was willing to fight a 20-year war and willing to be cast out into the mountains of Afghanistan for 20 years rather than break that alliance. Al-Qaeda is still there today, and some members of the Taliban government are actually members of al-Qaeda. So I think that an even bigger problem than our short-sightedness is our total inability to understand, and our refusal perhaps to understand, what the Taliban wanted and what Afghanistan was like. And there were, of course, 20 years of mistakes during this war and 20 years of not understanding Afghanistan. But that culminated, I think, in President Biden's decision-making, because he just did not understand that if he did what he did, the Taliban would take over in rapid fashion, and tens of thousands of Afghan allies and thousands of Americans would be left behind.
What I really appreciate about y'all's book is that it doesn't just talk about the leadership failures, which were massive and hugely consequential, but it also points out the stories of heroism that took place in the leadership gap that was there to be filled. For example, you talk about the private veterans groups who stepped in to help evacuate the Afghan allies who were left behind by the State Department. I'd love to hear you both talk a little bit more about some of the other unsung heroes from this withdrawal.
Yeah, to build off of that, the private veteran groups were just nothing short of heroic, and what a lot of people don't know is many of them emptied their 401ks to be able to keep the promises that the Biden administration broke. But then the greatest heroes were the enlisted Marines and soldiers manning the gates, and the junior officers who were leading them. We talked to a whole number of them, and we heard stories about them jumping into the crowds to rescue pregnant women who were about to be trampled, even when they knew there was a pending suicide attack. They were trying to pull people through all the way up until the last moments. In fact, when the bomb went off, some of them were pushing their way through the crowds to, basically try to, rescue as many last people as they could, or kind of standing alongside of the crowds to try and spot people is probably a better way to put it. But they just to a man and to a woman, they were nothing short of heroic. It was the everyday American people at their very best, and the American government at its very worst.
I'm wondering if either of you have anything to say about the dichotomy that we often hear in media of either we have these endless wars or we have this result where it's a really quick pullout by the U.S. military in a place like Afghanistan. Is there, a happy medium where we don't have these endless wars and we have a safe pullout from places like Afghanistan where we have active bases and active military?
Yeah, one thing that we emphasize in the prologue to Kabul is that Americans, including Afghanistan veterans, have all manners of opinions about whether or not we should have stayed in Afghanistan or whether we should have just completely pulled out. And no matter which side of that debate you fall on, one thing that we outline in our book in vivid detail is that no matter which opinion you take, one thing is perfectly clear: things did not have to end the way that they did in Afghanistan. And the president likes to say that, this was a success. Yesterday, Press Secretary Kirby for the Department of Defense tried to claim that the bombing was inevitable, and that's just nothing could be further from the truth. And I'll let Jerry kind of, tail off of that a little bit, if you'd like, Jerry.
Yeah. So, John Kirby claiming that, the CENTCOM investigation showed that there was that this Abbey Gate suicide attack was not preventable. Well, something important to point out is that the CENTCOM investigation did not interview Marine Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews, who has testified to Congress that he was receiving intelligence, detailed descriptions about the impending suicide attack and a detailed description of the suicide bomber, and that he and his Marine sniper team believed that they had identified the likely suicide bomber in the crowd on August 26th before the bomb went off. And he asked permission from his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Brad Whited, to take the shot. And Tyler says that the commanding officer told him that, well, he didn't have that authority to give permission to take the shot, and he didn't know who did. And, Tyler says that the suicide bomber then disappeared into the crowd, and obviously the bomb went off. And in the course of writing our book, we also found buried in these Pentagon documents sworn testimony from some other officers. One officer One officer said that U.S. intelligence knew that ISIS-K was staging in a hotel about 1.5 miles away from Kabul airport, and that Major General Chris Donahue asked the Taliban to assault that location, but that the Taliban never did. Another officer said that a U.S. strike was requested against an ISIS-K location in Afghanistan ahead of the Abbey Gate bombing, but that the strike was deemed infeasible by Major General Chris Donahue and by Rear Admiral Peter Vaisley due to a negative response from the Taliban. So there's a lot of testimony from people involved in the evacuation and from service members and intelligence officers on the ground who said that this attack, they were receiving a lot of intelligence about it coming, and that there may have been real opportunities to hit ISIS-K ahead of the attack, and potentially, according to Tyler Vargas Andrews, potentially even an opportunity to take the bomber himself out before the bomb went off. And that's not even including the fact that if we simply had maintained Bagram, this suicide bomber, Abdul Rahman al-Ghari, who was freed by the Taliban from that prison, if we had simply maintained that base, that bomber would have been stuck behind bars rather than threatening and ultimately killing Americans and Afghan civilians.
Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. I'm sorry to cut you off, but there's so many more harrowing stories in this book that I think people need to read to understand the full disastrous withdrawal that took place. Jerry Dunleavy, James Hasson, thank you both for writing it. Again, it's called Kabul, The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End. We'll be back with more Rising after this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.